Section 45 of Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Library of the World's Best Literature, Ancient and Modern, Volume 1, Section 45, Selection from Flute and Violin by James Lane Allen. Old King Solomon's Coronation, from Flute and Violin and Other Kentucky Tales and Romances, 1891. He stood on the topmost of the courthouse steps, and for a moment looked down on the crowd with the usual air of official severity. "Gentlemen," he cried out sharply, "by an order of the court, I now offer this man at public sale to the highest bidder. He is able-bodied, but lazy, without visible property or means of support, and of dissolute habits. He is therefore adjudged guilty of high misdemeanors, and is to be sold into labor for a 12-month. How much, then, am I offered for the vagrant? How much am I offered for old King Solomon?" Nothing was offered for old King Solomon. The spectators formed themselves into a ring around the big vagrant, and settled down to enjoy the performance. "Start him, somebody." Somebody started to laugh, which rippled around the circle. The sheriff looked on with an expression of unrelaxed severity, but catching the eye of an acquaintance on the outskirts, he exchanged a lightning wink of secret appreciation. Then he lifted off his tight beaver hat, wiped out of his eyes a little shower of perspiration which rolled suddenly down from above, and warmed a degree to his theme. "Come, gentlemen," he said more suasively, "it's too hot to stand here all day. Make me an offer. And you know old King Solomon. Don't wait to be introduced. How much, then, to start him? Say $50. 25. 15. 10. Why, gentlemen, not $10. Remember, this is the bluegrass region of Kentucky, the land of Boone and Kenton, the home of Henry Clay," he added, in an oratorical crescendo. "He ain't worth his victuals," said an oily tavern keeper, folding his arms restfully over his own stomach, and cocking up one piggish eye onto his neighbor's face. "He ain't worth his taters." "Buy him for his rags," cried a young law student with a Blackstone under his arm to the town rag picker opposite, who was unconsciously ogling the vagrant's apparel. "I might buy him for his scalp," drawled a farmer who had taken part in all kinds of scalp contests, and was now known to be busily engaged in collecting crow scalps for a match soon to come off between two rival counties. "I think I'll buy him for a hat sign," said a manufacturer of $10 Castor and Rorem hats. This sally drew merry attention to the vagrant's hat, and the merchant felt rewarded. "You'd better say the town ought to buy him and put him up on top of the court house as a scarecrow for the cholera," said someone else. "What news of the cholera did the stagecoach bring this morning?" quickly inquired his neighbor in his ear, and the two immediately fell into low, grave talk, forgot the auction, and turned away. "Stop, gentlemen, stop!" cried the sheriff, who had watched the rising tide of good humor, and now saw his chance to float in on it with spreading sails. "You're running the price in the wrong direction. Down, not up. The law requires that he be sold to the highest bidder, not the lowest. As loyal citizens, uphold the Constitution of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and make me an offer. The man is really a great bargain. In the first place, he would cost his owner little or nothing, because as you can see he keeps himself in cigars and clothes. Then his main article of diet is whiskey, a supply of which he always has on hand. He don't even need a bed, for you know he sleeps just as well on any doorstep, nor a chair, for he prefers to sit round on the curbstones. Remember, too, gentlemen, that old King Solomon is a Virginian, from the same neighborhood as Mr. Clay. Remember that he is well educated, that he is an awful Whig, and that he has smoked more of the stumps of Mr. Clay's cigars than any other man in existence. If you don't believe me, gentlemen, yonder goes Mr. Clay now. Call him over and ask him for yourselves." He paused and pointed with his right forefinger towards Main Street. along which the spectators, with a sudden craning of necks, beheld the familiar figure of the passing statesman. "But you don't need anybody to tell you these facts, gentlemen. You merely need to be reminded that old King Solomon is no ordinary man. Moreover, he has a kind heart, he never spoke a rough word to anybody in this world, and he is as proud as Tecumseh of his good name and character. And, gentlemen," he added, bridling with an air of mock gallantry and laying a hand on his heart, "if anything further is required in the way of a perfect encomium, we all know that there isn't another man among us who cuts as wide a swath among the ladies. Therefore, if you have any appreciation of virtue, any magnanimity of heart, if you set a proper valuation upon the descendants of Virginia, that mother of presidents, if you believe in the pure laws of Kentucky as the pioneer bride of the Union, if you love America and love the world, make me a generous, high-toned offer for old King Solomon." He ended his peroration amid a shout of laughter and applause, and feeling satisfied that it was a good time for returning to a more practical treatment of his subject, proceeded in a sincere tone: "He can easily earn from $1 to $2 a day, and from $300 to $600 a year. There's not another white man in town capable of doing as much work. There's not a nigger born in the hemp factories with such muscles in such a chest. Look at him, and if you don't believe me, step forward and feel him. How much, then, is bid for him?" "$1," said the owner of a hemp factory, who had walked forward and felt the vagrant's arm, laughing, but coloring up also as the eyes of all were quickly turned upon him. In those days it was not an unheard of thing for the muscles of a human being to be thus examined when being sold into servitude to a new master. "Thank you," cried the sheriff cheerily. "One precinct heard from. $1. I am offered $1 for old King Solomon. $1 for the king. Make it a half. $1 and a half. Make it a half. $1. Two medical students, returning from lectures at the old medical hall, now joined the group, and the sheriff explained: $1 is bid for the vagrant old King Solomon, who is to be sold into labor for a 12-month. Is there any other bid? Are you all done? $1 once." "Dollar and a half," said one of the students, and remarked half jestingly under his breath to his companion: "I'll buy him on the chance of his dying. We'll dissect him." "Would you own his body if he should die?" "If he dies while bound to me, I'll arrange that." $1 and a half," resumed the sheriff, and falling into a tone of a facile auctioneer, he rattled on: $1 and a half for old King Solomon. Sol, 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 do, re, mi, fa, sol. Do, re, mi, fa, sol. Why, gentlemen, you can set the king to music." All this time the vagrant had stood in the center of that close ring of jeering and humorous bystanders, a baffling text from which to have preached a sermon on the infirmities of our imperfect humanity. Some years before, perhaps as a master stroke of derision, there had been given to him that title which could but heighten the contrast of his personality and estate with every suggestion of the ancient sacred magnificence. And never had the mockery seemed so fine as at this moment, when he was led forth into the streets to receive the lowest sentence of the law upon his poverty and dissolute idleness. He was apparently in the very prime of life, a striking figure, for nature at least had truly done some royal work on him. Over 6 feet in height, erect, with limbs well shaped and sinewy, with chest and neck full of the lines of great power, a large head thickly covered with long reddish hair, eyes blue, face beardless, complexion fair, but discolored by low passions and excesses. Such was old King Solomon. He wore a stiff, high, black castor hat of the period, with the crown smashed in and the torn rim hanging down over one ear; a black cloth coat in the old style, ragged and buttonless; a white cotton shirt, with the broad collar crumpled wide open at the neck and down his sunburnt bosom; blue jean pantaloons, patched at the seat and the knees, and ragged cotton socks that fell down over the tops of his dusty shoes, which were open at the heels. In one corner of his sensual mouth rested the stump of a cigar, Once during the proceedings he had produced another, lighted it, and continued quietly smoking. If he took to himself any shame as the central figure of this ignoble performance, no one knew it. There was something almost royal in his unconcern. The humor, the badinage, the open contempt of which he was the public target fell thick and fast upon him, as would balls of pith upon a coat of mail. In truth, there was that in his great, lazy, gentle, good humored bulk and bearing which made the gibes seem all but despicable. He shuffled from one foot to the other, as though he found it a trial to stand up so long, but all the while looking at the spectators full in the eyes without the least impatience. He suffered the man of the factory to walk round him and push and pinch his muscles as calmly as though he had been the show bull at a country fair. Once only, when the sheriff had pointed across the street at the figure of Mr. Clay, he had looked quickly in that direction with a kindling light in his eye and a passing flush on his face. For the rest, he seemed like a man who has drained his cup of human life and has nothing left him but to fill again and drink without the least surprise or eagerness. The bidding between the man of the factory and the student had gone slowly on. The price had reached $10. The heat was intense, the sheriff tired. Then something occurred to revivify the scene. Across the marketplace and toward the steps of the courthouse there suddenly came trundling along in breathless haste a huge old negress, carrying on one arm a large shallow basket containing apple crab lanterns and fresh gingerbread. With a series of half articulate grunts and snorts, she approached the edge of the crowd and tried to force her way through. She coaxed, she begged, she elbowed and pushed and scolded, now laughing and now with the passion of tears in her thick, excited voice. All at once, catching sight of the sheriff, she lifted one ponderous brown arm, naked to the elbow, and waved her hand to him above the heads of those in front. "Hole on, marster, hole on!" she cried in a tone of humorous entreaty. "Don't knock him off till I come. Give me a bid at him." The sheriff paused and smiled. The crowd made way tumultuously, with broad laughter and comment. "Stand aside there and let Aunt Charlotte in." "Now you'll see biddin'." "Get out of the way fo' Aunt Charlotte." "Up, my free niggah. Hurrah for Kentucky." A moment more and she stood inside the ring of spectators, her basket on the pavement at her feet, her hands plumped akimbo into her fathomless sides, her head up, and her soft, motherly eyes turned eagerly upon the sheriff. Of the crowd she seemed unconscious, and on the vagrant before her she had not cast a single glance. She was dressed with perfect neatness. A red and yellow madras kerchief was bound around her head in a high coil, and another over the bosom of her stiffly starched and smoothly ironed blue cottonade dress. Rivulets of perspiration ran down over her nose, her temples, and around her ears, and disappeared mysteriously in the creases of her brown neck. A single drop accidentally hung, glistening like a diamond, on the circlet of one of her large brass earrings. The sheriff looked at her a moment, smiling but a little disconcerted. The spectacle was unprecedented. "What do you want here, Aunt Charlotte?" he asked kindly. "You can't sell your pies and gingerbread here." "I don't want sell no pies and gingerbread," she replied contemptuously. "I won't bid on him," and she nodded sideways at the vagrant. "White folks allers sellin' niggahs to wuk for dem. I gwine to buy a white man to wuk for me, an' he gwine to git a mighty hard mistress. You heah me?" The eyes of the sheriff twinkled with delight. $10 is offered for old King Solomon. Is there any other bid? Are you all done?" "Lebben," she said. Two young ragamuffins crawled among the legs of the crowd up to her basket and filched pies and cake beneath her very nose. "12!" cried the student, laughing. "13!" She laughed too, but her eyes flashed. "You are bidding against a nigger," whispered the student's companion in his ear. "So I am. Let's be off," answered the other, with a hot flush on his proud face. Thus the sale was ended, and the court variously dispersed. In a distant corner of the courtyard the ragged urchins were devouring their unexpected booty. The old negress drew a red handkerchief out of her bosom, untied a knot in a corner of it, and counted out the money to the sheriff. Only she and the vagrant were now left on the spot. "You have bought me. What do you want me to do?" he asked quietly. "Lord, honey," she answered in a low tone of affectionate chiding, "I don't want you to do nothin'. I wasn't gwine to 'low dem white folks to buy you. Dey'd have wukked you till you dropped dead. You go 'long and do as you please." She gave a cunning chuckle of triumph in thus setting at naught the ends of justice, and in a voice rich and musical with affection, she said as she gave him a little push: "You bettah be gettin' out of dis blazin' sun. G'on home. I'll be 'long by and by." He turned and moved slowly away in the direction of Water Street where she lived, and she, taking up her basket, shuffled across the market place toward Cheapside, muttering to herself the while: "I come mighty nigh gettin' dar too late, foolin' 'long wid dese pies. Sellin' him 'cause he don't wuk. Umph! If all de men in dis town dat don't wuk was to be took up and sole, dey wouldn't be 'nuff money in de town to buy 'em. Don't I see 'em settin' roun' dese taverns f'om mornin' till night?" Nature soon smiles upon her own ravages, and strews our graves with flowers, not as memories, but for other flowers when the spring returns. It was one cool, brilliant morning late in that autumn. The air blew fresh and invigorating, as though on earth there were no corruption, no death. Far southward had flown the plague. A spectator in the open court square might have seen many signs of life returning to the town. Students hurried along, talking eagerly. Merchants met for the first time and spoke of the winter trade. An old negress, gaily and neatly dressed, came into the market place and sitting down on the sidewalk displayed her yellow and red apples and fragrant gingerbread. She hummed to herself an old cradle song, and in her soft motherly black eyes shone a mild, happy radiance. A group of young ragamuffins eyed her longingly from a distance. Court was to open for the first time since the spring. The hour was early, and one by one the lawyers passed slowly in. On the steps of the courthouse three men were standing: Thomas Brown, the sheriff; old Peter Leuba, who had just walked over from his music store on Main Street; and little M. Giron, the French confectioner. Each wore mourning on his hat, and their voices were low and grave. "Gentlemen," the sheriff was saying, "it was on this very spot the day befo' the cholera broke out that I sole him as a vagrant, and I did the meanest thing a man can ever do. I held him up to public ridicule for his weakness and made sport of his infirmities. I laughed at his poverty and his old clothes. I delivered on him as complete an oration of sarcastic detraction as I could prepare on the spot, out of my own meanness, and with the vulgar sympathies of the crowd. Gentlemen, if I only had that crowd here now, and old King Solomon standing in the midst of it, I might ask him to accept a humble public apology offered from the heart of one who feels himself unworthy to shake his hand. But, gentlemen, that crowd will never reassemble. Nearly every man of them is dead, and old King Solomon buried them." "He buried my friend Adolphe Xaupi," said Francois Giron, touching his eyes with his handkerchief. "There's a case of my best Jamaican rum for him whenever he comes for it," said old Leuba, clearing his throat. "But, gentlemen, we are speaking of old King Solomon. We ought not to forget who it is that has supported him. Yonder she sits on the sidewalk, selling her apples and gingerbread." The three men looked in the direction indicated. "Here comes old King Solomon now!" exclaimed the sheriff. Across the open square the vagrant was seen walking slowly along with his habitual air of quiet, unobtrusive preoccupation. A minute more and he had come over and passed into the courthouse by a side door. "Is Mr. Clay to be in court today?" "He is expected, I think." "Then let's go in. There will be a crowd." "I don't know. So many are dead." They turned and entered, and found seats as quietly as possible. For a strange and sorrowful hush brooded over the court room until the bar assembled. It had not been realized how many were gone. The silence was that of a common, overwhelming disaster. No one spoke with his neighbor, no one observed the vagrant as he entered and made his way to a seat on one of the meanest benches, a little apart from the others. He had not sat there since the day of his indictment for vagrancy. The judge took his seat, and making a great effort to control himself, passing his eyes slowly over the courtroom. All at once he caught sight of old King Solomon sitting against the wall in an obscure corner, and before any one could know what he was doing, he had hurried down and walked up to the vagrant and grasped his hand. He tried to speak, but could not. Old King Solomon had buried his wife and daughter, buried them one clouded midnight, with no one present but himself. Then the oldest member of the bar started up and followed the example. And then the other members, rising by a common impulse, filed slowly back and one by one wrung that hard and powerful hand. After them came the other persons in the courtroom. The vagrant, the grave digger, had risen and stood against the wall, at first with a white face and a dazed expression, not knowing what it meant. Afterwards, when he understood it, his head dropped suddenly forward and his tears fell thick and hot. Not a man in the long file but paid his tribute of emotion as he stepped forward to honor that image of sadly eclipsed but still effulgent humanity. It was not grief, it was not gratitude, nor any sense of making reparation for the past. It was the softening influence of an act of heroism which makes every man feel himself a brother hand in hand with every other. Such power has a single act of moral greatness to reverse the relations of men, lifting up one and bringing all others to do him homage. It was the coronation scene in the life of old King Solomon of Kentucky. End of section 45.